She manipulated a dying old man for his money. My mother's voice cut through the Denver County courtroom with the kind of certainty that made my stomach twist, and I sat there at the defendant's table on May 15th, 2023, watching her say those words to a room full of strangers, as if she actually believed them. I was 28 years old, a senior aerospace engineer with a spotless reputation, and my own parents were suing me for $2.4 million, claiming I had somehow stolen my grandfather's inheritance through manipulation and deceit. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with wooden benches that creaked when people shifted their weight and fluorescent lights that made everything look slightly gray and unreal, and I couldn't stop touching the pocket watch that hung around my neck. My grandfather's pocket watch, the one he'd worn every day for 40 years. Robert Martinez had been a man of precision and intention, and this watch with its silver case and steady tick had measured out the seconds of his life until December 14th, 2022, the day he died in my arms after 3 months of me caring for him, while his own children, my parents, visited maybe once or twice and spent most of that time asking about his finances. The lawsuit papers sitting in front of my attorney Margaret Chen claimed undue influence, elder abuse, mental incapacity, fraud, a litany of accusations that painted me as some kind of calculating monster who had isolated and manipulated a vulnerable old man, and every word of it was a lie. My brother Tyler sat behind our parents, 26 years old, and looking uncomfortable in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. The golden child, who had been given everything, while I had been given nothing except my grandfather's love and attention. That's what this was really about, I knew, not the money itself, but the fact that our grandfather had seen something in me that he hadn't seen in them, had valued me in a way they never had, and they couldn't stand it. I touched the watch again and remembered the day he'd given it to me, just 2 weeks before he died, his hands shaking but his voice steady as he said, "Time tells the truth, Emma, and I've had enough time to see who you really are." The bailiff called for everyone to rise, and I stood on legs that felt disconnected from my body, exhausted from 4 months of depositions and discovery and sleepless nights. But underneath the exhaustion was something else, something quiet and solid that my grandfather had helped me build over 28 years of actually seeing me. Judge Sarah Brennan entered from her chambers, a woman in her early 50s with steel gray hair and an expression that gave nothing away. And as she took her seat and the bailiff announced, "The matter of Martinez versus Martinez," I realized that this moment would determine whether my grandfather's final wishes would be honored, or whether my parents would succeed in rewriting the story of who I was and what I'd meant to the man who'd loved me when no one else had bothered to try. It started when I was 7 years old, the pattern of being invisible in my own family, and I can still remember the exact moment I understood that Tyler mattered more than I did, sitting in the audience of my second-grade science presentation about the solar system while my parents' seats sat empty because Tyler had a soccer game across town that same afternoon. They went to every single one of his games, every practice that allowed parents to watch, every team pizza party, and I learned to scan the crowd at my school events with decreasing hope, looking for faces that were never there. Tyler got enrolled in Mountain View Academy, a private school that cost $18,000 a year, while I stayed in public school with overcrowded classrooms and outdated textbooks. And when I asked my mother why Tyler got to go to the fancy school, she said, "Your brother has special potential that needs nurturing," as if I didn't have any potential worth investing in at all. The financial disparity was everywhere once I started noticing it. Tyler got new clothes from department stores, while I got hand-me-downs from cousins. Tyler got the latest video game console, while I was told we couldn't afford such luxuries. Tyler got piano lessons and art classes and summer camps, while I spent summers at home or at the public library. But every Sunday, like clockwork, Grandpa Robert would arrive at our house in his old blue Toyota, the one he'd driven for 15 years because he said a car was transportation, not a status symbol, and he'd take me out for what he called our adventures, which meant everything from the science museum to the hardware store where he'd explain how different tools worked. He was 70 years old that year, retired from the engineering firm he'd built from nothing, and he had this way of looking at me like I was genuinely interesting, like my questions mattered and my thoughts were worth hearing. He taught me to play chess on a wooden board that had belonged to his father, explaining each piece's movements with the same patience he'd probably used teaching engineering students decades before. And he'd let me win sometimes, but not always, teaching me that losing was just information about what to do differently next time. We'd work on math problems together, him showing me tricks and patterns that made numbers feel like puzzles instead of punishment. And he'd ask me what I was curious about and then actually listen to my answers, something my parents never did, unless it related to Tyler somehow. I remember one Sunday when I was 8. Grandpa brought me a beginner's electronics kit, and we spent 4 hours building a simple circuit that made a light bulb glow, and when it finally worked, I felt this surge of pure joy that I'd made something, created something, that did what it was supposed to do. "You've got the mind for this," he told me that day, tapping his finger against his temple. "You see how things connect, how systems work, and that's a gift, Emma. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Those Sundays became the foundation of everything good I believed about myself. The only evidence I had that maybe I wasn't actually invisible, that maybe someone saw value in who I was. The pattern continued through my teenage years, with a consistency that would have been almost impressive if it hadn't hurt so much. And by the time I turned 16 in April 2011, I had stopped expecting my parents to show up for anything that mattered to me, which is why I wasn't even surprised when they missed the Colorado State Science Fair, where I won first place with my project on solar panel efficiency optimization. I had spent 7 months on that project, staying after school in the lab, running calculations until my eyes burned, building and rebuilding the testing apparatus with money I'd earned from my weekend job at the library. And when they announced my name as the state winner, I scanned the audience automatically, uselessly, already knowing my parents weren't there because Tyler had a baseball game. Not even a championship game, just a regular season game where he'd probably spend most of the time on the bench like he usually did. But Grandpa Robert was there in the third row, wearing the brown jacket he always wore to important occasions. And when I walked off that stage with my blue ribbon and my $5,000 college scholarship, he hugged me so tight I could barely breathe and said, "Your mind is going to take you places, Emma, places beyond what anyone expects." That's when I told him I wanted to study engineering like he had, that I wanted to design systems that mattered, and his eyes got bright in a way that made my chest ache because I realized this was what pride looked like. This was what it felt like when someone was genuinely happy about who you were becoming. My parents' reaction when I mentioned engineering at dinner 2 nights later was my mother laughing and saying, "Emma, be realistic. Women don't succeed in engineering. It's too competitive, and you'd be better off choosing something more suitable." And my father nodding along while Tyler smirked across the table, and neither of them even mentioned the science fair I'd won. That same year, my parents sat me down and explained that they wouldn't be able to help with my college expenses because money was tight. But I found out 3 months later that they'd set up a $50,000 college fund for Tyler, who was pulling C's and D's in his private school classes, while I was taking every AP course available and maintaining a 4.0 GPA. Tyler's mediocre achievements were treated like magnificent accomplishments in our house. A B on a test meant dinner at his favorite restaurant. Making the baseball team as a backup outfielder meant a new laptop. Expressing interest in maybe starting a business someday meant lengthy conversations about his brilliant entrepreneurial instincts, while my straight A's and academic awards were met with distracted nods and quick subject changes back to whatever Tyler was doing. I started working 2 jobs my junior year, one at the library and another tutoring middle school students in math and science, saving every possible dollar for college while watching my parents fund Tyler's every whim and excuse his every failure. And during those years, Grandpa Robert started talking to me differently, more seriously, about legacy and values and what really mattered in life, telling me stories about building his engineering firm from nothing and the importance of knowing your own worth, regardless of whether anyone else recognized it. I got my acceptance to the Colorado School of Mines in March 2015 with a partial scholarship that covered about 60% of tuition. And when I told my parents at dinner that night, my mother said, "That's nice, dear," without looking up from her phone, while my father asked if I'd considered something more practical, like teaching or nursing, and neither of them offered a single dollar toward the remaining costs, even though I knew they had money because they'd just paid for Tyler to join some exclusive golf club that cost $3,000 a year. Tyler had gotten a full-ride athletic scholarship to Colorado State for business, which seemed impossible given his mediocre grades and average baseball skills. But apparently, the coach owed my father some favor, and my parents acted like he'd been recruited by Harvard, throwing him a graduation party that cost over $2,000, while my own high school graduation gift was a card with $50 in it. I covered my remaining college costs through a combination of student loans, my savings from 2 years of working two jobs, and quietly, secretly, Grandpa Robert helped with the textbooks and lab fees, slipping me checks for $300 or $500 with notes that said things like, "For the engineer," or "Invested in your future." And he made me promise not to tell my parents because he said they'd made their choices clear, and he was making his. College was hard in ways that had nothing to do with the coursework, which I loved, but everything to do with watching other students get care packages from home and phone calls from parents asking how they were doing, while my parents called maybe once a month, and the conversations always circled back to Tyler within 5 minutes. How he was struggling with his classes, how he'd decided business wasn't for him after one semester, how he needed their support during this difficult transition. They visited Tyler at Fort Collins constantly, driving the 45 minutes to take him to dinner or bring him home for weekends. But they came to see me in Golden exactly twice in 4 years, both times because they were already in the area for something else. Tyler dropped out of college after 3 semesters, which my parents framed as him being brave enough to follow his entrepreneurial dreams, and over the next 2 years, they funded 4 different business ventures that all failed within months. A food truck that lost $23,000, a drop-shipping scheme that cost them $18,000, a cryptocurrency trading venture that somehow burned through $35,000, and a car detailing business that folded after 6 weeks, and another $20,000 gone. Meanwhile, I was making Dean's List every semester, working as a teaching assistant to offset costs, completing an internship at Lockheed Martin that paid $20 an hour, and my parents' response to any achievement I shared was a distracted, "That's good," before launching into whatever crisis Tyler was currently experiencing. I graduated in May 2019 with honors and a 3.87 GPA, with 6 job offers from aerospace companies, and when I called to tell my parents the graduation date, my mother sighed and said they probably couldn't make it because Tyler needed help moving to a new apartment after his latest business failed, and he was going through a hard time emotionally. Grandpa Robert came to my graduation alone, 82 years old, and moving slower than he used to, but beaming with pride. And when they called my name and I walked across that stage to receive my degree in aerospace engineering, I looked out at that crowd of thousands and found him immediately, standing and clapping with tears running down his face. And after the ceremony, he hugged me and said, "Your grandmother would have been so proud, Emma, so proud of the woman you've become." And I started crying because this man, this one person, had seen me my entire life when everyone else looked right through me. We went to dinner that evening, just the two of us at a quiet Italian restaurant he loved, and over pasta he told me that he'd been successful in his career and in building his business. But his greatest pride in life was watching me grow into someone with integrity and brilliance and determination, someone who succeeded not because of advantages handed to her, but because of who she chose to be. He said something that night that I didn't fully understand until much later, looking at me very seriously across the table and saying, Emma, remember this. Your worth isn't determined by who recognizes it, and my pride in you isn't diminished by your parents' blindness. And someday everyone will see what I've always seen. And I thought he just meant that I'd be successful in my career. But now I understand he meant something much bigger than that. I landed my first job in June 2019 at Apex Aerospace in Denver with a starting salary of $85,000, which felt like an impossible amount of money to me after years of scraping by on student loans and part-time work. And when I called to tell my parents about the offer, my mother said, "That's nice, sweetie," in the same distracted tone she used for everything I did. And then within 30 seconds, she'd changed the subject to Tyler's newest business idea. Something about flipping houses, despite him having no experience in real estate and no money to invest. Threw myself into my work with the kind of focused intensity that came naturally to me, the same way I'd approached everything in my life that mattered. And by the time I turned 25 in April 2022, I'd been promoted to senior aerospace engineer with a salary of $140,000 and a team of 4 people reporting to me, working on satellite propulsion systems that would actually go into space, actually matter. I called my parents to share the promotion news, thinking maybe this achievement would finally be significant enough to warrant real interest, but my father just said, "Good for you, Emma," before launching into a 15-minute monologue about how Tyler's house-flipping venture had failed and lost $44,000 of their money. But it wasn't really his fault because the market had shifted unexpectedly. Tyler's pattern of failures had become almost predictable by then. The food truck that collapsed after 8 months and cost them $23,000. The dropshipping business that somehow burned through $18,000 in 3 months. The cryptocurrency trading scheme that lost $35,000 in 6 weeks. The car detailing business that folded after a month and another $20,000 gone. And now the house flipping disaster. And after each failure, my parents would call me asking if I could help your brother get back on his feet, with loans that we all knew would never be repaid. I said no every single time, which created a tension in our already threadbare relationship that manifested in my mother's cold silences and my father's pointed comments about family loyalty. But I'd worked too hard for my money to watch it disappear into Tyler's endless cycle of half-planned ventures and inevitable failures. Grandpa Robert was 84 by then, and I could see him slowing down in ways that terrified me, his movements more careful, his energy fading by early evening, and I started visiting him 3 times a week after work, bringing dinner and staying to talk about my projects and his old engineering stories. And he'd listen with genuine fascination when I explained the propulsion calculations I was working on, asking questions that showed he really understood the complexity of what I was doing. My parents visited him maybe once a month, according to what he told me, and he said their visits usually lasted less than an hour, and the conversation inevitably turned to his finances, my mother asking questions about his investments, and my father making comments about estate planning and Tyler dropping hints about needing capital for his next venture. And I could see the disappointment in Grandpa's eyes when he talked about these visits, the sadness of watching his own son treat him like a future inheritance instead of a person worth knowing. In September 2022, Grandpa Robert was diagnosed with congestive heart failure after he collapsed in his kitchen and spent 2 days in the hospital. And when I got the call from his cardiologist explaining that his heart was operating at 30% capacity and he had maybe 6 months if he was lucky, I sat in my office at Apex Aerospace and felt the entire world tilt sideways because this man was the only person who had ever really seen me. I took 12 weeks of FMLA leave the next day, telling my supervisor that family came first and the propulsion system calculations could wait. And I moved into Grandpa's house in the Highlands neighborhood with 2 suitcases and the understanding that I was going to spend whatever time he had left, making sure he was comfortable and cared for, and not alone. My parents' response to his diagnosis was a phone call asking if he'd need to go into a nursing home and how much that might cost. And my mother visited twice in the first month, staying for maybe 45 minutes each time and spending most of that asking Grandpa if he'd updated his estate planning and whether he needed help organizing his financial documents. Tyler showed up exactly once in October, driving over in his leased BMW that he couldn't really afford, and within 20 minutes of arriving, he was telling Grandpa about his newest business idea, something involving cryptocurrency mining, and he actually asked our dying grandfather for a $30,000 investment while I was in the kitchen making soup and could hear every word through the doorway. The months that followed were the quietest and most meaningful of my life. Days that fell into a gentle rhythm of medication schedules and doctor's appointments and meals prepared with care. But mostly they were filled with conversation. Hours of sitting with Grandpa in his living room, surrounded by 40 years of memories, while he told me stories I'd never heard about building his engineering firm from nothing in 1978, about the contracts he'd won and lost, about selling the company in 2005 for $4.2 million dollars and investing carefully in index funds and bonds because he believed in living modestly and saving wisely. He told me that money was just a tool, that wealth meant having choices and security, but it didn't mean anything about your character. And he said he'd watched too many people, including his own son, chase money, like it would fill the empty places inside them, when what they really needed was purpose and integrity and connection. We talked about his disappointments, and he was honest with me in a way that was both heartbreaking and healing, telling me that watching my parents treat me as an afterthought for my entire life while pouring everything into Tyler had been one of the great sadnesses of his later years, that he'd tried to talk to my father about it a dozen times over the decades, but his son just couldn't see past his golden child to recognize what he was losing. One evening in early November, Grandpa looked at me across the chessboard we'd set up and said, "Emma, I want you to know I've been watching you your whole life, watching the choices you make when things are hard, watching how you treat people, watching you build something real through your own effort, and I've never been more certain of anything than I am of the person you've become." And I started crying because I'd spent 28 years hungry for that kind of recognition from my parents. And here it was, freely given by the one person whose opinion had always mattered most. On November 18th, 2022, I was in the kitchen washing lunch dishes when I heard Grandpa on the phone in his study, and his voice had that particular firm quality he used when discussing business matters, and I heard him say, "David, I need you to come by tomorrow if possible. I want to finalize those revisions we discussed." And I realized he was talking to his attorney, David Morrison, and something in my chest tightened because I knew what documents he meant even though we'd never explicitly discussed his will. The next afternoon, David arrived at 2 o'clock carrying his leather briefcase, a man in his early 60s who'd handled Grandpa's legal matters for 20 years. And Grandpa asked me to come into the study and said, "Emma, I need you to witness my signature on some documents. You won't see the contents, and that's intentional. I just need an impartial witness." And I sat in the chair he indicated while David laid out papers that he positioned so I could see the signature lines, but not the text above them. I watched Grandpa sign 3 documents with his still steady hand, watched David sign as attorney, and then I signed as witness where indicated, and the whole process took maybe 10 minutes, but felt weighted with significance I couldn't quite name. And after David left, Grandpa asked me to sit with him for a while, and we had a conversation I would replay in my mind 1,000 times in the months that followed. He took my hand in both of his skin papery and thin now, but his grip still strong, and he said, "Emma, I want you to understand something that I wish I'd said more clearly over the years. You've earned everything good that comes to you in this life through who you are, not what you've done, through your character and integrity and the choices you make when no one's watching." And I felt tears starting because I knew we were having the kind of conversation you have when time is running short. He told me that he'd made decisions about his estate that reflected his values and his observations over decades, and that when those decisions became known, some people might try to make me feel guilty or undeserving. And he said with absolute clarity, "Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for being valued. You don't owe anyone an apology for being seen and recognized for who you really are." And I remember thinking that he was preparing me for something, but I couldn't imagine my parents actually contesting his wishes, even if they were disappointed. We talked for over an hour that afternoon about legacy and what it really meant, and he said legacy wasn't about money passed down, but values lived out, and that he'd failed with his own son, but he'd watched me become exactly the kind of person he'd hoped to raise. Someone who worked hard and loved deeply and didn't measure worth in dollars. And by the time our conversation ended, I was crying, and he was crying, and we both knew without saying it that we were running out of time for these moments. December moved forward with the inexorable weight of goodbye, Grandpa's energy fading day by day, more time sleeping than waking. And I called my parents every few days with updates, and they came to visit on December 8th and stayed for less than an hour before my mother said they had a holiday party to attend. On December 14th, 2022, at 6:30 in the morning, I woke to find Grandpa struggling to breathe, and I called 911. But even as the paramedics worked, I could see in his eyes that he was ready to go, and he died at 8:15, with my hand holding his, and the winter sun coming through the window of the bedroom where he'd slept for 40 years. I called my parents from the hospital, and they arrived 2 hours later. My mother's first words were, "Did he suffer?" And my father's second question was, "What do we need to do about the funeral arrangements? What did he have set aside for that?" And Tyler showed up another hour later and actually asked me, "Did he leave any instructions? Did he say anything about his affairs?" While our grandfather's body was literally still in the building. I planned a small funeral for December 19th at the church Grandpa had attended for 30 years, invited his friends and former colleagues and the neighbors who'd actually known him, and maybe 40 people came to remember a man who'd lived with quiet integrity and asked for nothing but honesty in return. And I gave a eulogy about his commitment to doing work that mattered and treating people with dignity and measuring success by character rather than bank statements. And I saw my parents in the front pew looking uncomfortable, like I was somehow criticizing them by praising him, which maybe I was. On January 12th, 2023, exactly 4 weeks after we buried Grandpa Robert, I sat in the conference room of Morrison and Associates law firm on the 16th floor of a building in downtown Denver, the winter sun reflecting off the snow-covered mountains in the distance. And I felt numb in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with dread, because I knew this meeting was going to shatter whatever remained of my relationship with my parents. David Morrison sat at the head of the long mahogany table with Grandpa's will in front of him. My parents sat on one side with Tyler between them, looking uncomfortable in a suit he'd probably borrowed. And I sat alone on the other side, feeling like I was facing a tribunal, and David began by expressing his condolences again and explaining that Robert's estate had been fully probated and it was time to execute his final wishes. The numbers came first, laid out in David's careful attorney voice, and I watched my father lean forward when David explained that Grandpa's estate consisted of $2.4 million in investment accounts, the house in the Highlands valued at $800,000, and approximately $150,000 in other assets including his car and personal property, for a total estate value of roughly $3.35 million. And I saw my mother's eyes widen because I don't think any of us had realized Grandpa had been quite that comfortable. Then came the distribution details, and David read directly from the will, and his words fell into the room like stones into still water. To my son Richard Martinez and his wife Patricia Martinez, I leave $50,000 each to be distributed in a single payment, with my hope that they will reflect on the difference between price and value. To my grandson Tyler Martinez, I leave $50,000 with the hope that he will learn that legacy is built through effort, not inheritance. To my granddaughter Emma Louise Martinez, I leave the remainder of my estate in its entirety, including all investment accounts, my home and its contents, my vehicle, and all other assets, because she has demonstrated throughout her life the values I hold most dear: integrity, dedication, compassion, and the understanding that wealth means nothing without character. The silence that followed lasted maybe 5 seconds, but felt like an hour, and then my mother's voice cut through it, sharp and furious. "That can't be right. He wouldn't do that. She must have manipulated him. She poisoned his mind against us." And my father was already standing, his face red with rage, demanding, "He was senile at the end. Everyone knows that. This won't stand in court." And Tyler just sat there staring at the table until suddenly he exploded, shouting, "This is bullshit. What did I do to deserve nothing? I'm his grandson too. This isn't fair." David remained perfectly calm, his hands folded on top of the will, and he said in a voice that cut through the chaos, "Robert was of completely sound mind when he made these decisions. He was evaluated by his physician 3 weeks before his death and found to be in full possession of his mental faculties, and I can assure you this will is ironclad and reflects his true wishes." And then he pulled out a sealed envelope and said, "Robert also left a letter explaining his reasoning, which he requested I read aloud at this meeting." My mother tried to interrupt, but David simply began reading, and Grandpa's words filled the room, his voice somehow present in David's careful recitation, explaining that he'd watched his family for decades, that he'd seen how his son and daughter-in-law had treated their daughter as an afterthought while lavishing everything on their son, that he'd watched Emma build herself into an extraordinary woman despite being given nothing, that he'd watched her care for him in his final months, not out of obligation or expectation, but out of genuine love, and that he was leaving his legacy to the one person in his family who understood that money was just a tool and character was what really mattered. I sat there with tears streaming down my face, shocked because I genuinely had no idea the inheritance would be this substantial. I'd imagined maybe he'd leave me $50,000, or perhaps $100,000, and the rest would be divided among everyone. But this was everything. This was his entire life's work, and the weight of that trust felt crushing and honoring at the same time. My parents stormed out before David finished reading the letter, my mother stopping at the door to point at me and say, "You manipulated a dying old man for his money, and we will prove it. You will not get away with this." And my father added, "Our attorney will be in touch. This is elder abuse and we're going to make sure everyone knows what you did." And Tyler followed them out without looking at me. And then I was alone with David in that conference room, sobbing, asking him, did he really mean this? Did he really want me to have everything? And David looked at me with something like kindness and said, "Emma, your grandfather was more certain about this than anything I've seen in 30 years of practicing law. And he made me promise that if your parents contested it, I would fight with everything I had to honor his wishes, so that's exactly what I'm going to do." On February 23rd, 2023, I was at work reviewing structural specifications for a satellite component, when the receptionist called to say someone was there to serve me with legal documents, and my hands shook as I signed for the envelope, because I'd known this was coming, but hadn't let myself believe my parents would actually go through with it. And when I opened it in the privacy of a conference room, I saw the complaint header, Richard Martinez and Patricia Martinez, plaintiffs, versus Emma Louise Martinez, defendant. And the words blurred as I read their allegations that I had exercised undue influence over a vulnerable elderly man, that Grandpa had lacked mental capacity during his final months, that I had committed elder abuse by isolating him from his family, and that I had fraudulently manipulated him into changing his will. And they were suing for $2.4 million plus their legal fees and court costs, which meant they wanted literally everything Grandpa had left me. I sat in that conference room for 20 minutes, trying to process that my own parents were accusing me in legal documents of abusing the man I'd loved most in this world, that they were willing to drag his memory through court and paint him as senile and incompetent just to get money they felt entitled to. And the devastation I felt wasn't about the inheritance, but about the fact that they cared so little about honoring him that they'd destroy his reputation to punish me. I called David Morrison from the conference room, and he gave me the name of Margaret Chen, an attorney who specialized in estate litigation and had a reputation for being brilliant and ruthless in equal measure, and I met with Margaret 3 days later in her office in the Republic Plaza building, A woman in her mid-50s with silver-streaked black hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see right through my fragile composure. She read through my parents' complaint while I sat across from her desk trying not to cry, and when she finished, she looked at me and said, "They have no case whatsoever. The evidence they'd need to prove undue influence or incapacity simply doesn't exist. But they're counting on you being so emotionally exhausted that you'll settle just to make this go away. They're betting that you'll give them 500,000 or 1,000,000 just to avoid trial." And I felt something harden in my chest, because I realized that was exactly their strategy, to hurt me until I paid them to stop hurting me. Margaret explained that we'd go through a discovery process where both sides would have to provide evidence, and that I should start compiling everything I had that documented my relationship with Grandpa and his mental state. And over the next 6 weeks, I dove into what felt like an archaeological dig through my own life, gathering hundreds of photos from visits spanning 2 decades, printing out emails where Grandpa had sent me engineering articles or congratulated me on work achievements, creating a calendar showing that I'd visited him 3 times a week for years, while my parents came maybe twice a month, compiling my work records that proved I'd taken FMLA leave to care for him, and collecting his medical records that showed competency evaluations done a month before he died. The most powerful evidence came from a leather-bound diary I found in Grandpa's desk when I was going through his papers, pages and pages of his observations about family dynamics written in his precise engineer's handwriting, and reading those entries felt like hearing his voice again, hearing him see me clearly when my parents never had, and I knew these words would matter in court because they were his truth documented over years, not something that could be dismissed as deathbed confusion. Through March and April of 2023, I lived in a strange dual existence where I went to work during the day and came home at night to build the case that would defend Grandpa's final wishes. And my dining room table became covered with banker's boxes, full of evidence that documented a relationship my parents were claiming had been manipulative when it had actually been the most genuine thing in my life. The photographs alone filled 3 albums, hundreds of images spanning 2 decades showing Grandpa and me at my high school science fair, where he stood next to my solar panel project beaming with pride, at my college graduation, where he wore a suit and held a bouquet of sunflowers because he remembered they were my favorite, at countless Sunday dinners at his house, where we'd sit at his kitchen table working through engineering problems together, and dozens of photos from his final months where you could see the love between us even as his body weakened, and I remembered taking each of these pictures, never imagining they'd one day serve as evidence in a courtroom. But the diary entries were what made me cry every time I read them, because Grandpa had been quietly documenting his observations about our family for years, in his precise handwriting, and his words captured truths I'd felt but never fully articulated. There was an entry dated June 3, 2019, the day of my college graduation, that read, "Attended Emma's graduation from Colorado School of Mines today. Watched her walk across that stage to receive her degree in aerospace engineering, top 10% of her class, and I was the only family member there. Richard and Patricia didn't come because Tyler needed help moving to a new apartment, as if a 21-year-old man can't pack boxes himself. Emma saw me in the crowd and her whole face lit up, and afterward when I took her to dinner, she thanked me for coming like it was some extraordinary favor, instead of the basic requirement of loving someone. So proud of my granddaughter. Her parents' absence spoke volumes about their priorities." Another entry from September 2021 read, "Richard called today asking if I could invest $30,000 in Tyler's fifth business venture, some cryptocurrency trading scheme that will fail like all the others. Told him no. He got angry, said I was being selfish with money I'd just leave behind anyway, and that I was playing favorites. The irony is staggering. They've thrown good money after bad again and again with that boy, and he's learned nothing except that failure comes with a safety net. Meanwhile, Emma has built an entire career on her own merit, and they barely acknowledge it." The entry that broke me completely was dated November 28, 2022, just weeks before he died, and it read, "Emma has been here every day for 2 months now, took leave from her job to care for me, and I watch her navigate my illness with such grace and competence. She administers my medications, makes sure I eat properly, helps me to the bathroom when I'm too weak to make it alone. And she does it all without complaint or resentment. We talk for hours about engineering principles, about life, about what matters in the end. She's here because she loves me, not because of what I have. Richard and Patricia visit maybe twice a week, always asking about my finances or wanting to know about my will. The contrast couldn't be clearer. She's here because she loves me, not what I have, and I've made my decision about where my legacy belongs. Margaret compiled these diary entries along with the medical records from Dr. Patricia Okoye, showing that Grandpa had scored perfectly on cognitive assessments done on November 20th, just 3 weeks before he died, demonstrating clear memory, reasoning ability, and decision-making capacity. And we had video evidence from my phone showing conversations Grandpa and I had 2 weeks before his death where he was completely lucid, discussing complex engineering concepts and asking me detailed questions about my current aerospace project. We lined up testimony from Dr. Okoye, who would speak to his mental competency, from Harold Kim, the neighbor who'd lived next door to Grandpa for 15 years and had observed the family dynamics firsthand, from David Morrison, who would testify about Grandpa's clear intentions and sound mind when making his will, and from my supervisor at work, who would confirm that I'd taken FMLA leave specifically to provide care. Meanwhile, my parents' discovery responses were embarrassingly thin, mostly consisting of their own testimony claiming they'd wanted to visit more, but I'd monopolized Grandpa's time. Allegations without a shred of supporting evidence. And when their depositions happened in April, Margaret told me afterward that their case had essentially fallen apart under questioning because my mother had to admit under oath that Grandpa had declined at least a dozen of their phone calls in his final months. My father couldn't name a single specific instance of me preventing them from visiting. And Tyler's deposition was apparently a disaster, where he'd admitted that, yes, he had asked Grandpa for $30,000 for a business investment just 1 week before Grandpa died, which directly contradicted their narrative that I was the one focused on money. The trial began on May 15, 2023, in a third-floor courtroom of the Denver County Court building, and I sat at the defendant's table next to Margaret Chen wearing the navy suit I'd bought specifically for this occasion, and Grandpa's pocket watch tucked in my jacket pocket like a talisman. And across the aisle my parents sat with their attorney, a man named Gregory Walsh, who had slicked back hair and an expensive suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. And the reality of the situation hit me all over again, that I was in a courtroom facing my own mother and father, who were accusing me of crimes I'd never committed against a man I'd loved more than anyone. Judge Sarah Brennan entered at 9 o'clock sharp. A woman in her early 50s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, and sharp, intelligent eyes that surveyed the courtroom with an expression that suggested she'd seen every kind of family ugliness imaginable and wouldn't tolerate any nonsense. And Margaret had told me that Judge Brennan had a reputation for being fair, but exacting, that she valued evidence over emotion and had no patience for frivolous lawsuits or theatrics. Gregory Walsh presented my parents' case first, painting a picture of a vulnerable elderly man in declining health who had been isolated and manipulated by a cunning granddaughter who had moved into his house and controlled his access to the rest of his family, and he used words like undue influence and systematic alienation and exploitation of trust that made my stomach turn because they were describing someone I didn't recognize, some fictional villain who bore no resemblance to the exhausted, grief-stricken woman who'd spent 3 months watching the most important person in her life slowly die. My mother took the stand first, wearing a black dress that I'm sure was meant to convey mourning, and she testified through carefully orchestrated tears that she'd tried desperately to visit her father during his final months, but that I had controlled his schedule and limited our access and made them feel unwelcome in his home. And I watched her lie under oath with such conviction that I wondered if she'd actually convinced herself these things were true, if she'd rewritten history in her own mind to make herself the victim rather than the absent daughter who treated her father like an ATM. But Margaret's cross-examination was surgical and devastating, pulling out phone records that showed Grandpa had declined 17 calls from my parents in his final 2 months, text messages where I'd explicitly invited them to visit and included specific dates and times that had gone unanswered, and calendar entries from Grandpa's own phone showing that when my parents did visit, it was rarely for more than an hour and often included requests for money or investment advice. My father testified next, claiming that Grandpa wasn't himself during his final year, that he'd become confused and forgetful, and Yiyu Shouying Xiangde, susceptible to suggestion, and that he'd expressed concerns about Grandpa's mental state to multiple people. But when Margaret asked him to name even one specific instance of Grandpa demonstrating confusion or one person he'd expressed concerns to, my father fumbled and couldn't provide concrete examples, just vague assertions that something wasn't right, and he wasn't making good decisions. Margaret then introduced the medical records from Dr. Patricia Okoye, showing cognitive assessments performed on November 20th, less than 4 weeks before Grandpa died, where he'd scored perfectly on memory tests, spatial reasoning, problem-solving, and decision-making capacity, and the contrast between my father's vague accusations and the hard medical evidence was so stark that I saw Judge Brennan's expression shift from neutral attention to something that looked like carefully controlled annoyance. Tyler's testimony was perhaps the most painful because, unlike my parents, who seemed to have fully bought into their own narrative, Tyler looked uncomfortable on the stand, his eyes darting around the courtroom and never quite meeting mine. And he testified that Grandpa had often talked about how disappointed he was in Tyler's business ventures, and how Emma was the only one who'd done anything worthwhile, and that I must have planted these ideas in Grandpa's mind because he never used to compare us like that. But Margaret's cross-examination pulled out text messages from Tyler's own phone, including one sent to Grandpa on December 7th, one week before he died, that read, "Hey Grandpa, I know you're not feeling great, but I have this amazing investment opportunity, cryptocurrency mining operation, just need 30K to get started, could really use your help." And watching Tyler's face flush red as his own words were read aloud in court was the moment I realized their entire case was built on nothing but entitlement and revision of reality. When Walsh rested my parents' case after 2 days of testimony, it was clear they had presented nothing but emotion and accusation, without a single piece of concrete evidence that I had done anything improper. And I sat there processing the fact that I'd just watched my mother commit perjury, watched my father distort his own father's final months, watched my brother try to paint me as manipulative when his own messages showed he'd been asking a dying man for money, and the devastation I felt wasn't about the legal battle anymore, but about the confirmation that they would go this far, would damage Grandpa's memory this thoroughly, would lie this comprehensively, all for money they'd never earned and didn't deserve. On the morning of May 17th, the third day of trial, Margaret called me to the witness stand, and I walked across the courtroom feeling the weight of my parents' stares on my back, and placed my hand on the Bible as the bailiff asked me to swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And I said, "I do," with a voice that sounded steadier than I felt because I knew that everything I was about to say would be the absolute truth, even if my parents had spent 2 days lying about it. Margaret's direct examination began gently, establishing the basic facts of my background, and I testified that I was 28 years old, that I worked as a senior aerospace engineer at Lockheed Martin, earning $140,000 annually, that I had graduated from the Colorado School of Mines in 2019 with a degree in aerospace engineering with honors, and that my grandfather, Robert Martinez, had been the most important person in my life from the time I was a small child. Margaret asked me to describe my relationship with my parents growing up, and I kept my voice measured and factual as I recounted specific examples of the childhood dismissal I'd experienced, how they'd missed my 6th grade science fair where I won first place because Tyler had a baseball game the same day, how Tyler had attended private school while I went to public school despite similar academic performance, how at 16 I was told there was no college fund for me while Tyler had $50,000 set aside. And I watched my mother's face tighten with anger as I spoke these truths aloud in a court of law where they couldn't interrupt or dismiss me. Then Margaret asked about Grandpa, and my voice softened immediately as I described his weekly visits throughout my childhood. How he'd taught me chess and mathematics at his kitchen table. How he'd been the one person who showed up consistently to my school events and celebrated my achievements. How he'd helped me with textbook costs in college when my parents wouldn't contribute a single dollar. And how he'd cried with pride at my graduation ceremony, where he was the only family member present. Margaret walked me through the timeline of Grandpa's illness, starting in September 2022, and I testified about taking 12 weeks of unpaid FMLA leave from my job to move into his house and provide full-time care, about administering his medications 4 times daily, preparing his meals according to his cardiac diet restrictions, helping him with personal care when he became too weak to manage alone, and spending hours talking with him about engineering principles, about life, about what truly mattered. And I explained that during all those conversations spanning 3 months, he was completely lucid and mentally sharp, discussing complex technical concepts and asking me detailed questions about my current aerospace projects. Margaret asked if I'd known about the size of his estate, and I answered honestly that I'd known Grandpa was comfortable because he'd sold his engineering firm years ago, but I'd had no idea he had accumulated $2.4 million in investments, that I'd genuinely thought he might leave me something modest like maybe $50,000, or perhaps some of his tools and books, and that I'd been shocked when the will was read. "Emma," Margaret asked, "why did you take 3 months unpaid leave to care for your grandfather?" And I felt tears rising as I answered, "Because I loved him, because he'd been there for me my entire life when no one else was, because the thought of him spending his final months with strangers or alone was unbearable to me, and because caring for someone you love isn't a transaction where you expect payment, it's just what you do." Then Margaret introduced Grandpa's diary, holding up the leather-bound journal that had been entered as evidence, and asked, "Emma, did you know your grandfather kept a diary?" And I shook my head, genuinely surprised. And as Margaret began reading entries aloud, entries about my graduation day and his pride and my parents' absence, entries about watching me grow into someone with integrity and character, entries from his final weeks about how I was there because I loved him and not for what he had, I couldn't stop the tears that ran down my face because it was like hearing his voice again, hearing him defend me and validate me from beyond the grave. And when I looked up, I saw Judge Brennan leaning forward with an expression of deep attention, listening to every word of a dead man's testimony about the granddaughter he'd chosen to carry his legacy forward. Margaret continued reading from Grandpa's diary, entries that spanned nearly 20 years, and each one felt like a gift from beyond the grave, a validation I hadn't known I needed until I heard his words, spoken aloud in that courtroom. There was an entry from when I was 12 years old that read, "Emma placed third in the regional math competition today, solved problems most adults couldn't handle, but her parents didn't even acknowledge it at dinner because Tyler made the JV basketball team." And another from my 16th birthday that said, "Took Emma out for her birthday dinner since her parents were busy with Tyler's college campus tours. She told me she wants to be an engineer like me. I've never been more proud of anyone in my life." And a particularly painful entry from my college years that stated, "Emma called tonight, working 2 jobs to afford textbooks, won't ask her parents for help because she knows they'll say no. I sent her $500 and told her it was an early Christmas gift. The real gift is watching her refuse to let their neglect break her spirit." Margaret read an entry from November 2022, just 3 weeks before Grandpa died, that said, "Emma has been here every single day for 2 months now. She thinks I don't notice how exhausted she is, but I see her staying up late after I'm asleep doing work emails, taking calls with her team during my afternoon naps. She's sacrificing everything to make sure I'm not alone. and I know without any doubt that she's here because she loves me and not because she expects anything in return. This is who she's always been. This is why everything I've built should go to her. And I had to wipe my eyes because I'd had no idea he'd noticed all of that, no idea he'd understood the weight of what I was carrying. When Margaret finished reading the diary entries and rested her direct examination, Gregory Walsh stood up for cross-examination with an expression that suggested he knew his case was falling apart but was going to fight anyway. And his first question was, "Ms. Martinez, isn't it convenient that you were the only one present during your grandfather's final months when he made these decisions about his estate?" And I looked directly at him and said, "I was there every single day for 3 months, Mr. Walsh, and my parents were invited every single time. I called them weekly with updates on his condition and suggested specific days and times they could visit. They chose not to come." Walsh tried another angle, asking, "You must have known you would inherit everything, given the amount of time you spent with him." And I felt my voice strengthen as I answered, "I never asked my grandfather about his finances. I never asked what he planned to leave to anyone. I didn't care, because I wasn't there for an inheritance. I was there because watching someone I loved die alone was unthinkable to me. And if you can't understand that, I genuinely feel sorry for you." Margaret then introduced phone records showing that I had called my parents 16 times between September and December with updates about Grandpa's declining health, and that they had answered only 5 of those calls and never once asked if they could visit or if he needed anything, and the contrast between my documented attempts to include them and their documented indifference was so stark that I saw one of the jurors shaking her head in what looked like disgust. Walsh's final question came with what I'm sure he thought was dramatic impact. "Miss Martinez, what exactly did you do to deserve $2.4 million?" And I felt something shift inside me, a clarity that came from months of being attacked and accused and having my love for Grandpa twisted into something ugly. And I looked at Walsh and then at my parents and then at Judge Brennan and said, "I didn't do anything to deserve it, Mr. Walsh. Love isn't a transaction where you calculate what you're owed. I was there because that's what you do for people you love. You show up, you stay, you hold their hand when they're scared, you make sure they know they matter. And if my grandfather chose to leave me his estate, it wasn't because I earned it through some kind of service. It was because he saw in me someone who shared his values and would honor his memory. And I have spent every day since he died trying to be worthy of that trust, which is more than I can say for the people suing me." After my testimony concluded and I stepped down from the witness stand, Margaret called Dr. Patricia Okoye to testify, and the distinguished cardiologist in her early 50s took the oath and explained that she had been Grandpa's physician for the last 8 years of his life and had seen him regularly every 3 months for routine monitoring of his heart condition and more frequently during his final illness. Dr. Okoye testified that Robert Martinez had been mentally sharp and cognitively intact throughout her entire time as his doctor, that even during his final weeks when his physical health was declining rapidly, his mind remained clear and his decision-making capacity was completely unimpaired, and that she had actually conducted a formal cognitive assessment on November 20th, 2022, just 3 weeks before his death, using the Montreal Cognitive Assessment Standardized Test, and he had scored 28 out of 30 points, which indicated normal cognitive function for someone his age. Margaret asked if there was any indication of dementia, confusion, or diminished capacity, and Dr. Okoye stated firmly, "None whatsoever. Mr. Martinez was one of the most mentally acute patients I had. He could discuss complex medical concepts, make informed decisions about his treatment options, and he was very clear about his end-of-life wishes right up until his final days." And I watched my father's attorney scribble notes that I knew wouldn't help their case because the medical evidence was irrefutable. Next, Margaret called Harold Kim, Grandpa's next-door neighbor of 15 years, a retired postal worker in his 70s, who testified that he had observed the family dynamics at Robert's house over many years, and Harold stated that He had seen my car in Grandpa's driveway at least 3 times a week for years. That during Grandpa's final illness, my car had been there every single day from September through December, often overnight. And that in contrast, he had seen my parents' car perhaps once a month at most, maybe less. Harold testified about specific observations: how he had seen me helping Grandpa into the house after medical appointments, how he had noticed me bringing in groceries and supplies, how one evening in October he had seen me sitting on the porch with Grandpa wrapped in blankets watching the sunset, and he said, "I remember thinking that's what love looks like, just being present." And I remember thinking how lucky Robert was to have a granddaughter who showed up like that. And his voice carried a gentle conviction that made several jurors nod in what looked like agreement. Then Margaret called David Morrison, the estate attorney who had drafted Grandpa's will, and Morrison testified that Robert had contacted him in early November 2022, requesting an update to his estate documents, that he had met with Robert twice to discuss his wishes, and that Robert had been absolutely explicit and clear about wanting the bulk of his estate to go to me. Margaret asked Morrison to recount Robert's exact words, and Morrison consulted his notes and said, "Mr. Martinez told me, I want my legacy with the person who embodies my values. My granddaughter Emma has shown me through her actions and her character, over 28 years, that she understands what matters in life, and I trust her to honor my memory and use what I've built wisely." And I asked him multiple times if he was certain about this distribution, given that it would leave minimal amounts to his son and daughter-in-law, and he said, "I'm absolutely certain. They've shown me who they are, and Emma has shown me who she is. This is my choice, and I'm at complete peace with it." Morrison testified that Robert had brought up the will changes himself, completely unprompted, that there had been no suggestion or influence from anyone else, and that in his professional opinion after practicing estate law for 30 years, Robert Martinez had been one of the most mentally competent and decisively clear clients he had ever worked with regarding testamentary wishes. All 3 witnesses were consistent in their testimony, painting a picture of a clear-minded man who had made a deliberate choice to leave his estate to a devoted granddaughter while the rest of his family remained largely absent, and I could see my parents' case crumbling with each word spoken, could see Gregory Walsh's frustrated expressions as his cross-examinations failed to shake any of the testimonies, and when the final witness was excused, Judge Brennan looked at the evidence binders in front of her with an expression of someone who had already reached a conclusion. Then Judge Brennan did something unexpected. She called all parties to approach the bench, and my heart hammered as I stood and walked forward with Margaret while my parents and their attorney approached from the other side, and Judge Brennan looked directly at me with an expression that was searching and serious, and asked, "Ms. Martinez, if you could speak to your grandfather right now, what would you say to him?" And the question caught me completely off guard, because it wasn't a legal question, it was something deeper, something personal, and I felt tears rising immediately as I said, "I would tell him that I miss him every single day, that I think about him every time I solve a difficult engineering problem or make a decision about my life. I would tell him that I'm trying so hard to be worthy of the trust he placed in me, to honor his memory, not just by managing his estate responsibly, but by living according to the values he taught me about integrity and character and showing up for people you love. And I would tell him that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry that his final wishes are being fought over like this, that his memory is being tarnished by accusations and lawsuits, because all he wanted was for his legacy to go to someone who would respect what it represented. And I promise him that I do. I promise. I always will." Judge Brennan's expression shifted as I spoke. Something that looked like understanding or perhaps recognition passed across her face, and she nodded slowly and said, "Thank you for that answer, Ms. Martinez." And then she announced that court would recess for 2 hours while she reviewed all the evidence in chambers before issuing her ruling. And I walked back to my seat, feeling emotionally raw and exposed, but also strangely at peace, because I had spoken my truth, and there was nothing more I could do. The 2 hours felt like an eternity, and I spent them sitting on a bench outside the courtroom with Margaret beside me, Neither of us saying much because there was nothing left to say. All the evidence had been presented, and all the truth had been spoken, and now it was in Judge Brennan's hands. And when the bailiff finally called us back into the courtroom at 4:30 in the afternoon, my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat as I took my seat at the defendant's table and watched Judge Brennan enter and settle into her chair with an expression that was serious and composed and gave nothing away. She looked at the assembled parties, at me and Margaret on one side, at my parents and their attorney on the other, at the court reporter, and the few remaining observers in the gallery, and then she began to speak in a clear, firm voice that carried the weight of judicial authority as she said, "I have reviewed all the evidence presented in this case, including the testimony of witnesses, the medical records, the diary entries of the deceased, the phone records, and the statements of all parties involved, and I am prepared to issue my ruling." Judge Brennan continued, her words measured and deliberate as she stated, "The evidence before this court overwhelmingly demonstrates that Robert Martinez was a man of sound mind and clear judgment who made a conscious, deliberate decision about the distribution of his estate based on years of observation regarding the character and values of his family members." And she picked up Grandpa's diary and held it up as she said, "These diary entries, spanning 2 decades, represent powerful documentation of Mr. Martinez's reasoning. They show a man who was paying attention, who was noting patterns of behavior, who was witnessing how his granddaughter was treated by her parents and how she responded to that treatment with grace and determination, and who ultimately decided that his legacy should go to the person who embodied the values he held most dear." The judge's voice took on a sharper edge as she addressed my parents directly and said, "The plaintiff's case rests entirely on accusation and supposition with no concrete evidence of undue influence, elder abuse, or mental incapacity. In fact, the evidence proves the opposite, that Mr. Martinez was mentally acute until his final days, that he initiated the changes to his will independently, and that his granddaughter Emma Martinez provided care and companionship out of genuine love rather than expectation of financial gain." And then Judge Brennan looked straight at me and said, "This young woman sacrificed 3 months of her career, took unpaid leave, and devoted herself completely to ensuring her grandfather's final months were filled with dignity and love. While the evidence shows that the plaintiffs maintained minimal contact with the deceased, and in at least one documented instance asked him for money just weeks before his death." I felt tears streaming down my face as Judge Brennan pronounced her verdict, stating, "The lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice, meaning it cannot be refiled, and furthermore the plaintiffs are ordered to pay the defendant's legal fees in the amount of $47,000. Because this case represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what inheritance means, it is not an entitlement based on blood relation. It is a gift bestowed by someone who has the absolute right to determine who should benefit from their life's work. And Robert Martinez exercised that right with careful thought and clear intention." And she concluded by saying, "We honor our dead not by fighting over what they left behind, but by respecting their final wishes, and this court will ensure that Robert Martinez's wishes are honored as he intended." My parents' reaction was immediate and explosive, my mother standing up with a gasp of outrage and my father's face turning red with anger as they both turned and walked rapidly toward the courtroom exit without looking back. And Gregory Walsh gathered his materials with tight-lipped frustration while Margaret squeezed my hand in quiet triumph. Tyler had been sitting behind our parents, and as they stormed out he stood more slowly, and for just a moment he turned and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Something that might have been regret or recognition or simply exhaustion, and his mouth opened like he wanted to say something, but then he shook his head slightly and followed our parents out into the hallway, and I realized I might never know what he had been about to say, might never have any kind of reconciliation with my brother, and I was surprised to find that I could accept that possibility without the crushing grief I once would have felt. Outside the courthouse 20 minutes later, standing on the steps in the late afternoon sunshine of a warm May day in Denver, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me that had nothing to do with winning the lawsuit and everything to do with knowing that Grandpa's wishes had been honored, that his careful observations and deliberate choices had been validated, that the values he had tried to teach me about character and integrity and showing up for people you love had been recognized as worthwhile. And as I touched the pocket watch at my throat, I could almost feel his presence beside me, could almost hear his voice saying, "I'm proud of you, Emma, not because you won, but because of who you are." 6 months later, in November 2023, I stood in a conference room at the University of Colorado, Denver, and officially announced the establishment of the Robert Martinez Engineering Scholarship, a fund seeded with $100,000 from Grandpa's estate that would provide annual scholarships to underrepresented students pursuing STEM degrees, students who showed not just academic promise, but also character, determination, and resilience in the face of obstacles. And as I spoke about my grandfather's legacy and his belief that education and integrity were the foundations of a meaningful life, I saw the faces of the first 3 scholarship recipients, and I knew this was exactly what Grandpa would have wanted, his money making a difference in the lives of young people who reminded him of who I had been at their age, hungry to learn and determined to succeed despite lack of support. I kept Grandpa's house, the modest 3-bedroom ranch in Littleton, where I had spent so many weekend afternoons learning chess and talking about engineering principles and being seen for who I really was. And I made it my home, filling it with my own belongings, but keeping his study exactly as he had left it. His books on the shelves and his old drafting table in the corner, and his favorite chair by the window, where he used to sit and read, because being in that space made me feel connected to him in a way that brought comfort rather than grief. My parents never contacted me again after the trial, and while that reality carried its own kind of pain, I found I could make peace with it because I finally understood that their inability to see my worth was about their limitations and not my value, that I had spent 28 years trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it while having unconditional love from someone who saw me clearly the entire time. And Grandpa's gift to me wasn't really the money or the house or even the validation of the trial verdict. It was the example he provided of what it means to really love someone, to pay attention to who they are, to value character over convenience, and to show up consistently even when it would be easier not to. I realized that I had succeeded in honoring Grandpa's legacy, not through how I managed his estate, but through who I had become, through the values I carried forward, through the way I showed up in the world with integrity and dedication and a commitment to using whatever I had, whether that was my engineering skills or my time or my resources, to make things better for others. And that understanding brought a peace that no court verdict could have provided. On a cold December evening, almost exactly a year after Grandpa died, I sat at my desk in his study working on specifications for a satellite propulsion system, wearing his pocket watch and drinking coffee from the mug he had given me when I graduated college. And I thought about how he used to say that legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's who you leave behind, the people whose lives you've touched and the values you've instilled in them. And I understood finally that I was his legacy just as much as he was mine, that we had created each other in important ways, and that the greatest inheritance he had given me wasn't measured in dollars, but in the certainty that I was loved and valued and seen, and that certainty would carry me forward for the rest of my life.